Hi, Founder fans. Welcome to Founder of the Day. Welcome to our live weekend review. I'm a little out of breath. I just ran downstairs to get one more plug to charge this light while we did it, because I always forget that these are a lot longer than my normal videos and I need to plug that light in. So hopefully you can see me. Welcome. I hope everyone's having a nice freezing cold day, because it is freezing cold outside. It has been snowing here in central New York, which is not usually out of the ordinary, but this deep into May, considering last week I was outside and mowing my lawn and planting in my garden. Well, not planting, luckily, but getting it ready. I hope you guys are having a nice warm day. Let's see, as people start getting signed in here, hello to everyone as we're signing in. Just a reminder, what we're doing here today is we're talking about the articles in the last week that I published for founderoftheday.com. Of course, the first two articles are old that I republish on the weekends because I need 2 days off. And then we'll talk about all the new founders that I learned about recently that I'd like to share that information with you, of course. Let's see, we're lucky actually, because the last week's two articles are both about Benedict Arnold. We'll talk about that a little bit. As much as we don't like him so much, he is a fascinating character in American history. As we're getting started, I do want to give a shout out to a company called Liberty & Co., which you might notice my collar's not buttoned. And the reason for that is I have this great Benedict Arnold shirt on. Hey Matt, sign in? I just meant as people log in, that's all. Yeah. The other day I've talked about in a video the pine tree riots, and Tyson over at Liberty Co. reminded me that one of his candles, the scent that they have, is based off, they did research on the pine tree riots for that. Liberty Co. has sponsored articles of mine in the past. This is not sponsored, this video. I am just a big fan of their products. Their t-shirts, for example, have amazing designs like John Adams' law firm, or Paul Revere and Sons Foundry, and things like that. And they're super comfortable. I wear them all the time. Not to mention, I actually have one of their mugs in the back here. The George Washington, might be hard to see there, but the George Washington flag mug. Which these are about to run out for a limited time only. There's only like 4 or 5 left, so if you want one, go now. I did put a link in the description below. Again, highly recommend their products. They have candles, they have banners, they have everything you would want from the American Revolution, or not from the American Revolution, but if you're a fan of the Revolutionary War, they are, in my opinion, the best merchant retailer of American Revolutionary wares. So, again, whenever you see me wearing a collar, there's like a 75% chance I'm wearing an Liberty & Co. shirt underneath. So, I definitely want to give them a shout out. Let's see, people are signing in, so let's get underway. I also am going to say, and think about it through the video, 3 o'clock on a Saturday I have realized is not the best time to have these videos. Today it's snowing, but people are often out and about, going about their lives on Saturday. So I was thinking about moving it to a different day of the week. Maybe like Thursday nights at like 7 or something of that nature. Maybe 6 o'clock after dinner. So, you know, leave me a comment. Let me know if there's a different day of the week you're interested in. And on top of that, of course, any questions or comments, let me know as we go along. That's the point of the live chat, is we can, you know, get off topic a little bit if we want to and chit-chat about the revolution. So, well, let's start getting into it. Now, last weekend, as I said, were both Benedict Arnold publications, and unfortunately, not everyone loves Benedict Arnold. I had 2 articles. One is called Benedict Arnold Hero, ? Let me say that again. Benedict Arnold Hero? And the other one is Benedict Arnold 8 Reasons for His Treason. So, people love to click on these articles, but they also love to give me a lot of trouble about them. And I understand why. When I say Benedict Arnold's a hero, I'm not necessarily saying he's a hero to me right now. What I'm saying is Benedict Arnold was a hero to your average patriot during the Revolutionary War. It's what makes his treason so incredibly important to the American Revolution. In fact, here we are almost 250 years later. A quarter of a millennia has gone by. And I published an article just asking, is he a hero? And people don't even read it. They just start commenting angrily at me right away. That's the impact this man had. And the reason is because he was so important. Michael Troy, in his great podcast, the Amrev podcast, actually commented, or he said he aligned it to General Patton in World War II. So say just before D-Day, General Patton decides to leave the United States Army and go join the Nazis and lead the Nazis in the Western Front against the Americans. That's the type of association. I feel like that's a perfect analogy for how impactful it was that Benedict Arnold left. And we'll get a little bit into why he was a hero, well, right now. So, I'm not going to get all the way into Arnold's story, but Arnold was a self-made man. His family did come from money, but his dad was kind of a drunk and blew it. And Arnold had to work his way up. He worked in a pharmacy and then eventually became a merchant and bought his own ship and captained his own ship and then bought other ships that had other people captained and really was a self-made man. And then when the time came to start the war, Arnold was one of the most outspoken people in Connecticut, really for going to war. In fact, he basically went to his local powder supply and demanded from the local government that they give it to him, or else they were going to storm, they're actually going to attack other patriots who weren't as aggressive. But this is in the aftermath of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. He was going to storm that, and eventually they gave it to him, thankfully, and then he went and joined Lexington and Concord. But on top of that, he's the one who convinced Washington to go attack Fort Ticonderoga in New York, which ended up being a very important early victory for the Patriots. After that, he led a bunch of troops through the Maine wilderness so that they could meet the American army in the invasion of Quebec. And through all this, Arnold is earning the respect of his men more and more. He takes he becomes military governor of Montreal after the Battle of Quebec goes kind of south and a bunch of people die. And then on Lake Champlain in New York, he ends up essentially building the first American Navy, literally building the boats from scratch on the shores of Lake Champlain. And Horatio Gates, who was the general in charge at the time, puts Arnold in charge of constructing these boats. And then he goes and attacks the British Navy as they're coming down in a very risky move at Valcour Island. He basically hides behind an island, and when the British come, he attacks them. And then when a fog comes in, or the cover of darkness comes in, he's able to sneak away later and somehow win this naval victory that he really shouldn't have won. He just was pretty good at generaling. From there, he goes back home. I should also note, by this point, he's been injured once. He's already been shot. He goes back home to Connecticut when the Battle of Ridgefield breaks out. He has at least one horse shot out from under him, and his leg is shot out again, wounded again. And then he goes to Saratoga, and during the Battle of Saratoga, he famously, although there's been a lot of, his role has been, boosted from what it actually should be. Let me say that again. It is often said that he was told to stand down by Horatio Gates and then disobeyed orders and came out on the field triumphantly and won. Now, there has been recent evidence proven by Mr. Eric Schnitzer over at the Saratoga battlefield. He's done a lot of wonderful research and proven that Arnold wasn't ever ordered really to stand down. He was not the best friends with Horatio Gates, but Gates knew how important he was and put him on the field. Either way, Arnold goes out and leads men in the battle and essentially wins the Battle of Saratoga. It's a big battle, a lot of important people were involved, but Arnold was a main driver, and the soldiers, the rank and file troops, really looked up to him the entire time. And that's why, one of the reasons he became a hero to these people. And after that, he even went down and became, he was again injured many times and had to leave the battlefield. He kept getting shot and kept having horses shot out from under him. And at one point, his horse was shot out and landed on his leg and crushed his leg, which would be shorter than the other one afterward. And he had to walk with a cane for the rest of his life. Because, heroes dedicate their lives to their country. After that, he would be appointed as military general after the British would go invade Philadelphia. And then they kind of left for no reason. And then the Patriots came back and Arnold was put in charge as military governor of Philadelphia, the biggest city in the colony, in any of the colonies. And then he would be put in charge of West Point, which was a hugely important fort. And then, of course, he would go and try and give West Point to the British, and that was his treason, and that didn't go so well. But the point is, the day before Arnold defected and became a traitor, he was one of, if not the most respected heroes of the American Revolution. And again, I'm not saying right now that he is. I'm saying that at the time, before he became a traitor, he certainly was just unbelievably respected by almost all of the troops and most of the leaders. But that's the general overview of why he was a hero. We now need to turn our eyes to why he was a traitor. Now, this isn't a justification for his treason, because trust me, when I published this article, I was accused of just that. It's not a justification, it's an explanation. And there's a reason that the most avid anti-British, pro-patriot, like hardcore, let's go to war, go for independence fighter in the country ended up changing sides. This wasn't something he did flippantly. Now, to be fair, Arnold was a very conceited person by all accounts, and he was mostly concerned about his own image, and his own pride, and his own wealth. But that's not the reason he traded sides. Essentially, well, let's go through it. First, early on, during the retreat from Quebec, he was accused of abusing his position. People had said, you know, oh, you're profiting off the war, and this and that, and he almost received a court-martial for his behavior. He was accused of plundering the homes of citizens in Montreal illegally. Again, none of this was true. He was almost court-martialed for it, but that wasn't really true. But the slander hurt his feelings, his very sensitive feelings. Probably most importantly, he kept getting passed over for promotion. It took him a while just to be appointed as a brigadier general in the Continental Army. Which, if you're not familiar, you know, major general is the highest rank, George Washington. And then there were a bunch of major generals, and then brigadier generals under that. And Arnold took a while to get promoted to brigadier general, and then it took him a very long time to get promoted to major general. And people lower than him were getting promoted to brigadier general. And Arnold rightfully claimed that many of these lesser generals who were getting promoted over him, they were lesser generals, they were just better politicians. They were kissing ass to the Continental Congress. And, like, a lot of that was true. And Arnold was far from the only person to have this complaint. It happened fairly frequently. Either way, he did have probably the biggest claim to being upset about it. Because he was winning battles. Like, he was leading men. He was very respected. When, like, most of the Continental Army wasn't. So, many people in the Continental Army, when they were passed over in rank, they would resign. Because these were men of honor. Honor was very important to these people. And they would be passed over in rank and they would resign. Arnold tried to do this. He tried to resign from the Continental Army because he kept getting passed over. And it was a statement of like, no, look, I'm better than these people. I deserve it. Everyone knows it. I'm going to go. But George Washington refused Arnold's resignation. Again, demonstrating how important General Arnold was to the Continental Army. George Washington said, no, we'll lose without you. Just you. Washington let other people resign. There were a few people he talked out of it. But he told Benedict Arnold, you need to stick around. You need to stay. And he did. His pride was wounded. He was embarrassed, but he did stay. He then participated in the Battle of Ridgefield, as I said before, where he was again shot, but was a hero that day. He did eventually get promoted because of his work at Ridgefield to Major General. So he did get that promotion, but his seniority was not restored. So the way it works is, there's a bunch of Major Generals, but they're ranked in seniority from, you number 1, Major General 1, Major General 2. Same thing with Brigadier Generals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So these other Brigadier Generals have been appointed over him. He got appointed Major General, but he did not get the seniority over the people he previously had seniority over. So he was now a Major General, but still working for people who he felt, kind of rightfully, should be working for him. Finally, there was the alleged story that he was relieved of command. We're not going to go too much into this, but like I said with Eric Schnitzer before, there's the idea that he was relieved of command by Horatio Gates, although that has been a little bit disproven. We're not going to get too much into that. Then eventually his seniority, Arnold's seniority was restored over these other people, but it was basically out of sympathy because, as I said, he had shattered his leg and could barely walk for the rest of his life. And he was embarrassed that he only got the seniority he deserved from his actions out of sympathy, at least in his perspective. Then he got court-martialed when he was governor of Philadelphia. He was again accused of taking from loyalists and selling off this stuff to enrich himself, which in fact he most certainly was, but this was not an uncommon practice at the time. Except in Philadelphia, there were a lot of loyalists that were allowed to hang around because, well, it was a big city and they liked having rich people there, essentially, and some of these rich people were in the Continental Congress, not the loyalists, but those patriots who were rich people still had friends who were loyalists and didn't like Arnold coming in and taking their stuff. And then Benedict Arnold married Peggy Shippen. So I was talking about loyalists. Certain Shippen family members were patriots. I believe it's William Shippen. I can't remember the gentleman's name, but one of the directors of the Continental Army's medical department was a Shippen. But many of the wealthiest Shippens remained loyalist, and, well, one of them was Peggy Shippen. Her loyalties were undetermined, but he married her and she was seen as a loyalist, and that had a lot of suspicion. And additionally, if you've seen the show Turn, you'll know very well, or any other movie about Benedict Arnold, his wife Peggy Shippen was friends with a Major John Andre. They had become friendly when the British were in Philadelphia, and she connected Benedict Arnold with John Andre, and she was basically the middle person in eventually getting Arnold to give British information and become a traitor. So his wife was not really great about it, but she definitely egged him on to do so and helped him decide to be a traitor and then actually become a traitor. So that's a good slew about Benedict Arnold. Let's see, is there any questions? No questions. If you guys have questions, I'm here for it. But we'll continue on. A lot about Arnold, but again, there were 2 articles I wrote about him today, this week. So, excuse me, that is it. So, we're going to move on to Jacob Duché. Jacob Duché was the first chaplain of the Continental Congress. He was a young preacher who was known in Philadelphia for being a wonderful speaker, gives great sermons, blah, blah, blah. So the Continental Congress gets together, and on the first Continental Congress, on their first day, they elect a president, and they all present their credentials. And the only thing that they really did, other than just acknowledge that they were allowed to be there and choose a president, was decide to have a prayer for their well-being. Separating church and state wasn't really a thing at that point, and they were all, at least on the facade, men of religion. Most of them actually were. A few of them were probably deists and blah, 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 but even Ben Franklin, who was a deist, is the one who, oh no, he was not there. Whoops, almost told you a lie. I'm sorry. I was confusing the First Continental Congress with the Constitutional Convention 13 years later. But all the people there were frequent churchgoers, and they wanted to have a prayer. So they decided to, very specifically, they requested that Jacob Duché come and give the first sermon. And he did that, and apparently everyone was wowed by it. When you read the Diary of John Adams, he was wowed by it, and everyone really enjoyed it. Duché would then stay on as the first chaplain of the Continental Congress, essentially the spiritual leader of the First Continental Congress. Now, the First Continental Congress only lasted about 7 weeks, as opposed to the Second Continental Congress, which lasted 15 years. But the First Continental Congress, he gave the speeches, then they all went home. Then, it turns out that Jacob Duché had a change of heart. So he remained in Philadelphia when the British came and took the city over. While most of the Continental Congress fled the city, because they would have been, hung, Jacob Duché stayed around, and he was taken and questioned and interrogated, and we don't really know how that went, but we do know when he was done, he was no longer on the Patriots' side. I did forget to mention, after independence was declared, Jacob Duché led the preachers of Philadelphia to remove the king from any prayers, because it was custom at the time that when you're praying, you pray to God and for the king. And he was the one who basically said, let's not pray for the king anymore. We're a new nation now. And then he got questioned, probably harshly, and then he came out and said, well, maybe we should reconsider this independence thing. And although he was a hero to many patriots for his attempt, for his taking the king out of your prayers, he ended up writing a letter to George Washington, who was then stationed at Valley Forge with the Continental Army, who were suffering a terrible cold winter. And Duché recommended to Washington, hey, let's lay down our sword and sue for peace with England and try and mend our fences. Now, this didn't happen, nor did it go over well, and he was essentially ostracized from Philadelphia community. He would actually go to London for a few years and take control of an orphanage before eventually he suffered a stroke and then returned in the 1790s to the United States, where he spent the last few years of his life. So he would come back. I noted he was actually, he married the sister of Francis Hopkinson, who I haven't talked a ton about on this, but Hopkinson was a Declaration signer who was the artist of the American Revolution. He helped create many of he was a songwriter and painter, and he helped create many of the early symbols of the United States. And that's essentially it for Jacob Duché. That's a nice brief overview of his life. Again, questions, comments, let me know. If not, I'm going to continue on with John Henry. Now, there are a few John Henrys in the American Revolution. We do see several names overlapping. This John Henry was a mystery. He has a lot of mysteries in his life. It seems that he came from Ireland. He was born in Ireland, and he came to the United States just after George Washington became president, so a little bit later in the founding. But he did serve for America in the quasi-war with France that broke out in the John Adams administration. And after that, he moved to Vermont and was contacted somehow. Now, this is the mysterious part. I was unable to determine how, but he was put in contact with the royal governor, Sir James Craig, who was the royal governor of Canada. And at this time, the Napoleonic Wars were going on, and it was some Americans, including President James Madison, wanted to get into a war with Britain for several reasons, which we're not going to get too deep into now. But there were war hawks, including President James Madison and many other senators who wanted to go to war with England. And then there were the Federalist Party, who at this point had pretty much died out and just still were around in New England. But the Federalists didn't want to go to war at all. And, John Henry was tasked in secret to spy on the people of New England, specifically in Boston, to see if a war broke out with England and America, if New England was interested in seceding from the United States. So he carried on this correspondence and indicated that, yeah, there's a good chance that they would. And to be fair, about 3 years later, the conversation was discussed at the Hartford Convention. So it wasn't out of the question. It most likely would never have happened because it was a small segment of people who wanted it to happen. Most people kept cooler heads about it. So John Henry was communicating with the governor of England, and then he was all done, and he went to get paid, except then Sir James Craig, the governor, died, and John Henry didn't have any money, so he traveled to London, but this was a secret correspondence that London didn't seem to know about, so he didn't get any money, and then he, upset, was returning to the United States, when apparently he met a man named, what was his name? Edward de Crillon. Now, Edward de Crillon was a con man, and his name wasn't Edward de Crillon. But this person gave John Henry the brilliant idea to sell these papers to President James Madison. What's fascinating about this is that James Madison actually bought the papers. Sight unseen, didn't know what it contained, gave this guy money. Now, James Madison bought these papers for $50,000. That's $50,000 in 1812 money. So, to put this into perspective, since he wanted to go to war, James Madison could have bought a warship for this money. A ship to send to war for $50,000. Which was an argument many of the Federalists made when he did this. Because he was spending government money on these papers. And he had never read them, and there was no way to authenticate if they were real or not. But John Henry happily sold him these papers, and then left town just before it was given to Congress and published. The Henry Papers, as they were called, were actually one of the final sticking points in sending the United States to war, because there were just enough people on the border that these papers convinced them, okay, let's go to war. And essentially, this John Henry, who we know very little about his early life, was able to turn the tide of history by sending the United States into what many people call the Second American Revolution, or the final part of the First American Revolution. Yeah, yeah, 50 grand, man. That's a lot of dough. I don't know exactly what the transfer today would be, but as I said, a small warship today costs how many $1 million? And that's essentially what he spent on these papers. Of course, the Federalists, who did not want to go to war, said, why are you wasting government money on this? If you really want to go to war, why don't you buy a ship? Because the Navy was super small, didn't have a lot of ships, and at this point the British Navy was still the mightiest naval power in the world. And and also, how do you even know these are real? Some guy sold them to you? That these are correspondence with the dead governor of Canada, who we are about to invade, which one of the reasons we went into that war is we did want to invade Canada again after we tried during the Revolution. Interestingly, as for John Henry, he would go to France. He left before the papers were published, got out of Dodge. He went to France, and then Edward de Crillon, whose name I can't say for some reason, Edward de Crillon, who he had met on his way back from London. Like I said, he was a con man, so Crillon actually sold Henry some land in France that didn't exist. Now, fortunately, Henry had just ran into a major amount of dough, so he was able to go and buy some property in France, where he spent the rest of his life. He's an extraordinarily minor character in American Revolutionary history, but he has this one moment that turned the tide. So, someone we definitely need to look at. Moving on, I wrote about a man named John Fries. Now, when we talk about the American Revolution, people will be familiar with Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts, or the Risky Rebellion in western Pennsylvania, but I've overlooked, and I think many people have overlooked, this Fries Rebellion. It was the third anti-tax rebellion during the American founding. It took place during the John Adams administration, and most of us are familiar with the Alien and Sedition Acts, that when the Quasi-War with France broke out, John Adams led the way on passing, and essentially gave the it said the alien part of the acts was for immigrants, and then the sedition part of the acts was if you print or publish anything bad about the United States, we are going to, or the president specifically. John Adams didn't want the president getting getting trash talked to because he was the president. And they arrested several journalists at this time. Now, often overlooked is they also passed a law called an act to lay and collect direct tax. And this was to raise money for the war and for the United States, because at the time, really, they only took in excise taxes. So what they would do is, you got taxed based on the amount of land you owned, the amount of slaves that you had, and the size of your dwelling. Now, in Pennsylvania, slavery by 1798, had already been outlawed for almost 20 years. So that wasn't a big deal. But in eastern Pennsylvania, there was a big segment of Pennsylvania Dutch, which were German farmers, and many of them didn't even speak English very well. But what they did know is that these taxmen kept coming to the house, and the way that they figured out how big your land was, your dwelling was, is they looked at the number of and size of your windows. So if you had a lot of big windows, you would be taxed more. And the idea was that not only I actually had someone ask me if windows were a demonstration of wealth, and like to a little degree they were. That's why if they were bigger, that definitely indicated you had a little more money. But the bigger the windows, the bigger the house. The more windows, the bigger the house. And that was kind of the way they seemed to look at it. Now, people didn't love the tax man coming and looking at their property and seeing how many windows they had. And also a big problem was they claimed that this wasn't, according to the Constitution, taxes need to be apportioned based on population. And this wasn't apportioned based on population, it was apportioned based on the size of your property and your house. And this was, as is still argued today, seemingly unconstitutional. Now this has been changed because of the, I believe it's 16th Amendment, if I'm not mistaken. I mix up, there's all those amendments that came in the early 1900s real quick, and I get those all scattered up. You know, the Internal Revenue Service, Prohibition, women's voting, suffrage, they all came at the same time, so I just lose the numbers. So I apologize. But at the time, this was unconstitutional, and that was the argument. And a man named John Fries, who was pretty much a simple, how did they claim him? Auctioneer. That's what his job title seems to have been. An auctioneer. He was a simple auctioneer who really didn't like what was going on. He was actually a veteran of the Revolutionary War, and just a few years earlier in western Pennsylvania, he helped suppress the Whiskey Rebellion, which was, again, a similar type of revolt against taxation. Now, he really didn't like this apportionment garbage, so he decided to have, he got a bunch of people together, and they started rallying, and then the tax collectors came, and they got run out of town, and then some sheriffs and marshals came, U.S. Marshals came and arrested some people, and then they got attacked and run out of town, and then John Adams called in the military, who came in and suppressed the rebellion. Fries was arrested, a few other people were arrested too. He was actually convicted and sentenced to be hung, but he was pardoned by John Adams. First of all, kind of to calm public sentiment. Second of all, although he would never admit this, probably because he had kind of a point. And most importantly, he actually pardoned everyone involved. And he seems to have done this because he was, or I shouldn't say seems. He said he did this because the Germans in that area were not familiar with the language of the United States. Most of them actually spoke German, and he said a lot of them have problems with the language and therefore definitely have problems with the laws. And they got rallied up by certain people, and everything's cool now, so we'll pardon them. But it's very interesting. I had only heard, before I really put research into this article, I had only heard about Fry's Rebellion a few times and never really dug into it. I'm surprised, because when I was reading through it, you know, you read through the letters of, I read a bunch of letters with Thomas Jefferson talking about it. Several of the big founders, a lot of the lesser knowns, were all really concerned about Fry's Rebellion, which is interesting. And let me know if you have any questions or comments or concerns as we go, but I'll continue on to William Duane, I believe. Yes, William Duane, who I actually stumbled onto while I was researching Fry's Rebellion. Although I had known about William Duane, I'd seen him frequently throughout the years, and was actually surprised I haven't written about him yet. Duane was an important newspaper publisher, as were many of the most famous publishers that are the most hated. He was printing Democratic, Republican slanted printings, very favorable to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and their whole crew. So Duane was actually born in upstate New York, up by, I think it's Champlain, New York, on Lake Champlain. And then his father passed away when he was young, so they moved to London. And he grew up, Ireland. He moved to Ireland, grew up there, and then got a job in London. And he worked with a printing house. And then he actually went to India, where he started a paper called the Bengal Journal, which is interesting because this is the second consecutive week I've mentioned India while discussing the American Revolution, which is definitely strange. Probably don't see that happening again for quite some time. He printed there for a while, but he printed anti-king stuff, and again, he was in a British colony. This was during and after the American Revolutionary War. But just because we had a Revolutionary War here in North America, India still had colonies for a very long time. And so he was in a British colony. He started printing anti-Parliament propaganda, as well as promoting the French Revolution when it broke out. He was really impressed with the French Revolution. But the governors of India were not impressed. They were not happy. So he actually got kicked out of India to go back. He got deported and went back to the United States. Went back to England, and then eventually came to the United States, where he started working on the Aurora. The Aurora was a paper published by Benjamin Franklin Bach, who was a grandson of Benjamin Franklin. And essentially, William Duane became Benjamin Franklin Bach's number 2. Benjamin Franklin Bach was one of the people arrested under the Alien and Sedition Acts, although he died of, I believe it was yellow fever while awaiting trial. And at that point, William Duane took over the Aurora. And for the next 30 years, ran the Aurora as one of the most important papers in the young nation. He would serve in the War of 1812 briefly, but he came into conflict with President James Madison at that point because he didn't feel respected, I guess, despite his years of pro-Madison propaganda. He would actually go on to be pretty forward-thinking. He was against the Missouri Compromise, which we all know essentially was one of the major steps to leading to civil war. And he supported Andrew Jackson when he ran to president. Was a big supporter of Andrew Jackson and didn't like the banks. And was even still around when the Jacksonian democracy era comes into play. Let's see. Any questions? Not yet. Quiet today. Quiet day. That's okay. Everyone's all huddled up from the cold. Can't type. I get it. So, last thing we'll talk about today. How are we on time? 36 minutes. All right. Last thing we'll talk about today is Federalist Number 79. I, of course, write about a Federalist paper once a week. We are up to week 79, technically week 80, because like the Federalist papers, I took a break a few weeks back to write about the break they took. So I didn't really take a break. In Federalist 79, Alexander Hamilton continues his discussion on the courts and the Supreme Court. And he talks a little bit about salaries. First, he talks about salaries, noting that the Congress can never reduce the pay of a judge. Because if they have that power over the judge, and this echoes something Hamilton discussed in Federalist 73 about the president, which if the Congress can lower what's being paid to a president or a justice, then they have control over their livelihood, and therefore have control over their decisions. And we want the judicial department to be independent of the legislature. So, excuse me. I think this is the furthest I made it without taking a drink of water throughout one of these live videos. So, excuse me. So you can't pay Congress. You have to pay Congress. I'm sorry. Congress has to pay the justices. They can only raise their pay. They can never lower it. And with inflation, this makes sense. He then goes on to ease fears about aging poorly. I'll remind you that the Federalist Papers were written in New York for New Yorkers, because New York was on the fence about joining the Union more than anyone else. And additionally, that's where Hamilton lived. So Hamilton's writing to the people of New York, and he brings up the point that New York's Constitution at the time said a Supreme Court justice had to retire when they turned 60. And Hamilton points out that this is not right. I mean, plenty of people who hit 60 years old, yeah, their bodies might start failing them, but most people's mental capacity is still there. Additionally, for the Supreme Court of the United States, even if one or two justices start losing their mental facilities, first of all, they should be talked out of it and to retire on their own. Second of all, you'll never have a situation where all or a majority of the Supreme Court justices are losing their facilities. Third, if they really start making terrible decisions that everyone agrees, like, this person can't handle this job anymore, well, they can be impeached for bad behavior, which is how it's termed in the Constitution, but really for any reason Congress sees fit. And he goes on to point out that to be a Supreme Court justice, or really any type of justice in the judicial department, you need to take a lifetime of study to learn the laws of the land and figure it out and be able to make reasonable decisions independently of other people's wants and desires. And if you do this for a lifetime and then there's an age limit, like you turn 60 and then you're kicked out, well, what are you supposed to do for a living? You're not getting a new job if you're like at 60 years old when your whole life has been a law justice. I mean, I guess you could be a lawyer, but like he actually says that it's cruel. Hamilton actually says it would be cruel to do this to someone who served their country for their life. To kick them out on their butts with no pay, just like that. But let's see essentially what happens in Federalist Number 79. And that's pretty much it for the week. We're 40 minutes, a little bit shorter than some of our previous editions. Again, I want to give a heads up to Liberty & Co. It doesn't say it on the shirt, but look at this. Look how sweet this John Adams, law firm and John Adams shirt is. They're super comfortable. I wear them all the time. I'm not sponsored giving this statement. This is not a sponsorship. This is just, I'm a fan of their work. So I highly recommend you go to Liberty & Co. Liberty&.co. It's a clever way to do it. You guys have any questions? I think it just doesn't seem like it. Okay, well then I'm going to go. I feel like there was something I was supposed to remind you before I did, but after I speak for 40 minutes, I can't remember. Oh, I do want to say, if you guys have any interest in me doing this a different day of the week, I realize Saturday's a tough day, and there's usually 3 or 4 of us on these chats, but if we did it on a Thursday, maybe we get up 10, 20 people. I know most weeks we're gaining one person at a time. I know there's people, I don't see Ned or TJ are not here today, but I assume you'll be here next week. No hard feeling, guys. I'm sure you'll watch it and review. And like I said, if there's an easier day for everyone, possibly Saturdays aren't the best day. Maybe Sunday nights. Maybe that would be fun. I don't put out a video Sundays, so we could do that. Let me know in the comments. And as far as that goes, thank you for watching, and I'll be back with another founder on Monday.